Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second of our issue briefings. This will be our webinar on money in politics and the legislation in that area that we are working on with the League of Women Voters and Maine Citizens for Clean Elections. I'm going to give a couple minutes for more people to join us. So just sit tight and we will get started in a couple minutes. And if you're just joining us, this is the issue briefing on money in politics legislation with Maine Citizens for Clean Elections and the League of Women Voters of Maine. We will get started with the presentation in a couple of minutes. And a reminder, if you haven't used one of these webinars before, you can ask a question at any point throughout in the questions part of your screen, and we will likely be answering most questions at the end of the presentation. But if something goes wrong and you can't hear us, or you've got something that comes up that you want to make sure you don't forget to ask later, feel free to put in questions there as they occur to you. Great, and we'll get started. For those of you just joined, welcome to the second of our issue briefings in our advocacy webinar series. We're going to be talking about money in politics legislation today. We are really excited about what we're working on in this legislative session and the potential impact that it can have on getting big money out of Maine politics. So we'll start off today with a little bit of background around what can be done to regulate money in politics, why it's an issue, but more importantly, what we can do about it. We will also talk about one of the most important things that we have done and continue to do to make sure that Maine leads on money in politics, the Maine Clean Elections Act, and how that is relevant to our work in the legislature this year. And then we'll talk about a couple of the bills that we're working on, proactive measures to get money out of politics in Maine and reduce the influence of special interests, and go into a little bit of what's been going on so far in this legislative session, what's coming up, and what you can do about it. So my name is Anna Keller. I'm the Executive Director for Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, League of Women Voters of Maine. With me, I have Allison Smith, an advocacy committee member and longtime champion of clean elections. Allison, say hi so we know your voice.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep, sounds great. And Allison is going to start us off with some of the background around money in politics and the damage that it can do to our democracy. Take it away when you're ready.
Okay, thanks. Thanks everybody for joining the webinar today. So I'm sure everybody on the call can name some problems of money in politics. Candidates, we all know are either very wealthy or they spend way too much time courting donors, asking for money. They need to raise so much money that they inevitably go to the wealthy and well-connected to raise those funds. And either way, it's basically those with wealth and privilege who enjoy the best representation. Inevitably, policies that benefit those folks are, they inevitably result. So that can be discouraging to the rest of us whose influence stops pretty much at the voting booth. And when this pattern repeats itself cycle after cycle, it's easy to just kind of throw up our collective hands and fall into a mode of cynicism. We wonder, Is there any way out of this pattern? And that, I would argue, is the real damage. Our biggest enemy really is not the Koch brothers or the big funders, but cynicism. So, and I don't know how to advance the slides apparently, so I hope that, there we go.
There you go.
Thanks. So the good news is there is, plenty we can do, and it's really worth working on. Pretty much everyone, regardless of where they are in the political spectrum, wants to get big money out of politics. The work is certainly challenging, but practically everything we work on here at Maine Citizens for Clean Elections and the League of Women Voters really is popular with the general public. We work on transparency, reducing opportunities for corruption and the appearance of corruption, lessening the influence of big money donors, enabling a broad cross-section of people to run for office to improve that representation for regular folks. People really do like this stuff, and this is why we're also passionate about the work. This stuff really can make a difference. The idea of making democracy work is both timely and timeless, and our money in politics work here at the League and MCC fits squarely into it. Can we get to the next slide?
Yeah, we do. And I just was going to say that looking at all of these numbers, it's so striking to me that there's such strong support for the fact that there should be limits on the amount that candidates can spend on their campaigns, and strong support for new laws to reduce the role of money in politics. But there are fewer people who think that new laws could be effective in reducing money in politics than there are people who think that there should be limits. And that gap between what people think should be done and what they think can be done really goes to what you were saying about cynicism.
Well, one hopeful note is that among the youngest demographic, they're believers. If you go back, we had 68% in that youngest demographic of 18 to 29 who think there ought to be limits, and even 69% think new limits could be helpful. So that's the only demographic where they're, really more hopeful. As the older you get, a little more cynical you get. So that's why it's so important to keep doing what we do. And so it brings us to the question, what can we do? There is luckily plenty. And one of the things we have done in Maine is really groundbreaking, which is have clean elections, a full public funding system. But there are some challenges. Someone once compared trying to regulate the influence of money in politics to playing baseball with a tree growing in the middle of the field, and that's what you see on your screen. And that tree, ever since the aftermath of the Watergate years and the reforms that followed, that tree has been the Supreme Court in decisions going way back to the 1970s and continued in more recent decisions that we're familiar with, like Citizens United. The Supreme Court has determined and affirmed over and over that money is a form of free speech. Sometimes it seems like unlimited spending in elections is the only or the highest form of free speech the Supreme Court will recognize. And that just seems perverse to the rest of us. So we can regulate the size of contributions, but we can't regulate how much money candidates spend. That's just not an option for us in the U.S. as long as these court decisions stand. We can regulate contributions to candidates in order, for just very few reasons. One of them, really one of the few left standing, is to prevent quid pro quo corruption. In other words, I give you money and therefore you vote the way I want you to vote on a bill, or to prevent the appearance of corruption. But that can be a really tough standard to meet. And we all know that the corruption is not that narrow. It's a corruption of the whole system. We want political equality in our country. We want to realize the promise of America and make sure that, we're all equal when it comes to our democracy. Some people are working on changing these court decisions, bringing challenges up through the court system, but that is a long-term process. Others are working on a constitutional amendment that would simply say money is not speech. It's okay to regulate contributions and expenditures, but that's another long-term solution. In the meantime, there's plenty for us to do in Maine and elsewhere. So one of the things that we have broken ground on here in Maine is our Maine Clean Election Act. I'm sure most of you have heard of clean elections. They're probably pretty familiar with it. We have led the way. Back in 1996, we became the first state in the nation to have a clean election program. It's a full public funding program so that candidates for our state offices can run for office without raising private money. It's really groundbreaking. We passed a citizen-initiated referendum. We won in 1996. Ever since then, we've fought hard to expand and protect clean elections, defend it from every challenge, and we even won another referendum to strengthen it in 2015. And again, with a victory in court last summer, and many, many legislative fights in between. Many of those fights in between have been about funding, and we continue that work this year. So what have we got? When we talk about clean elections, what do we mean? Oh, sorry, did I miss it?
No, going back.
Okay, so just to be clear, clean elections means a voluntary system of public financing for candidates for the legislature and for governor. It's a program that enables qualified people to run for office people without personal wealth or high-powered connections, all kinds of people. It's a program that makes elected officials accountable to the people of Maine rather than wealthy contributors or special interests. All those things are hallmarks of the clean election system.
And I think the fact that it's a voluntary system means that we can get around so many of the things that the court makes difficult. So where if candidates agree to public funding, we can limit the amount of money that they are able to spend. We can say they can't take any contributions from corporations or PACs or unions right outside of the small limits of amounts that individuals can give. So it allows us to do so many of the things that we want to do in our system when we use clean elections. And like Allison said, the biggest fights that we've had about the system over the years and continuing have been around funding. And the clean election system requires $3 million in funding per year. That works out to be, about $3 a voter a year. We think that's a real bargain and cost worth paying to have a government that's actually accountable to the people. But that funding does have to be allocated each year, or every 2 years in the state budget process. And this has been a fight over the years to make sure that enough money gets put into the fund, that the legislature doesn't say, oh, hey, there's a lot of money sitting in the Clean Elections Fund. I don't know if they're going to need all of that money this year. Why don't we spend some on something else and we'll put it back in time for the election, when often they don't put it back or they don't put all of it back. And so the fund in the balance in the Clean Elections Fund over the years has gotten farther away from the amount that it should be. And so we are often fighting to get money put in just in time for an election. The worst example of this being last summer when, thanks to what was shown to be an unconstitutional action by the governor, he refused to sign off on spending money that had already been allocated for candidates that were running and were already signed up to use clean elections. But we are able to win in the court. We are able to get a decision that actually strengthens the Clean Election Fund and makes it harder for candidates, harder for elected officials to mess with it in the future. And so heading into this legislative session, we are committed to making sure that there is the funding for clean elections in the budget that is required, that funding goes in early, that there are no, we don't have to have a last minute fight about it at the end of the session that could cause an error in the budget like happened last year. We are pretty confident this year, given that 69% of the current legislature use clean elections for their campaigns, and with strong support from legislative leadership and the governor for clean elections, that we will have an easier time with that funding. One of the other things, though, that having a friendlier legislature and governor toward the clean elections program gives us the opportunity to look into is also the Ethics Commission itself. So the Ethics Commission regulates and enforces campaign finance law in Maine, including administering the clean elections program. And that state agency has been routinely underfunded over the years, and in order to keep their operating costs going, have pulled money from the Clean Elections Fund to support the operation of the Ethics Commission. And that is what had to be done then, but we want to make sure that they have strong funding moving forward, so that not only do we have a clean elections program that candidates can use, it's also being administered well, there's strong enforcement, and the kinds of safeguards and audits that go into that program and into campaign finance law in general are being done and done well. So funding is always a battle, but for us this year, we're particularly excited because we know that there's a chance for us to move forward on some other issues beyond the funding battle. And so even though almost 2/3 of the legislature runs using clean elections, we're still concerned about the influence of big money on the legislators that use private funding. One source of funding that raises particular concerns is lobbyists, the very people who are in the halls in Augusta talking to legislators, trying to get them to vote one way or another on a bill. Those people shouldn't also be giving money to those candidates' campaigns. It's one of the things that gets closest, in our opinion, to that issue of corruption and the appearance of corruption. To be clear, lobbying is a legitimate activity. I, as an employee of Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, go to Augusta. I'm a registered lobbyist, but the difference is that once money gets introduced into that equation, there starts to be this unsavory aspect of the appearance of influence due to the money, not due to the quality of your ideas and convincing a legislator. And so right now, there is a bill that would ban lobbyist contributions. It's LB 54. We had a really strong public hearing for that bill a couple weeks ago, and it just had its first work session. I'm going to get a little bit into the details of this, and if you listen to our earlier webinar about the legislative process, this will be clear, but I'm going to try to make sure that I explain my terms as I go along. So every bill gets a public hearing, and then the committee, in this case, Veterans and Legal Affairs, debates the bill, sees if they want to make any amendments to it, and then votes on it. And that happens in a meeting called a work session. We had a work session on LB 54 last week, and a couple of things came up in the course of that work session. So when we drafted this ban on lobbyist contributions, we looked at the existing ban, because right now, lobbyists can't give contributions during the legislative session. When the legislature is in session, lobbyists and the entities, whether that's a corporation or organization that employ the lobbyist, they're also banned from giving during the legislative session. The problem is, the second the legislative session is over, the fundraising emails go out, the lobbyists start getting called and asked for money. Literally, we're on the lobbyist list here, and the second that the gavel goes down and that the session ends, you start getting emails, come to this fundraiser. The chair of the Energy Committee is having a fundraiser, and you, as somebody who lobbies in front of that committee, should come to this fundraiser. It's as blatant as that sometimes. And we kept thinking, well, if this is wrong during the legislative session, why isn't it wrong the day before or the day after the legislative session? This should be a year-round ban. Then we started looking at constitutional issues. We still feel pretty strongly that you could defend a year-round ban on contributions from a lobbyist and from a lobbyist employer. But no state has done that in the past. So there are other states that ban lobbyist contributions year-round, and there are states that ban contributions from lobbyists and the lobbyist employers during the legislative session. Nobody has done both year-round. And so in our conversations with the committee, we realized we could get, we hope, a ban on lobbyist contributions. But a ban on the entities that employ lobbyists, that would be tougher for us to get through the committee. So we are proposing an amendment to our own bill, or to Senator Justin Chenette's bill, I should say, since he's the senator who put it in, that would have it be just lobbyists. And that would still be a really big success. And it keeps the door open for us to come back in the future and look at, say, banning contributions from all corporations, whether they have a lobbyist or not. And that would actually be on a stronger legal footing. So we are looking at this as an opportunity to get another slice of the pie, another step forward in this legislative session with this bill. During the work session last week, they didn't actually vote. So we are waiting to have a second work session. They tabled the bill, going to come back in, have that conversation, and try to get a strong vote out of the committee. If there's a strong vote out of the committee on this, we think there's a good chance of it passing in the House and Senate and getting signed by the governor. There is pretty strong support from it from Senate leadership, which is also helping to move this bill forward. And having worked on it in the last session, compared to the atmosphere around it this session, I'm pretty optimistic. There's still a lot to be done for legislators to understand that this is something that their voters actually care about. That it's not just me saying it or Allison saying it, but that a lot of Mainers are concerned about the influence of lobbyists, they're concerned about the influence of special interests on their legislators, and that they do see corruption. They do look at it and go, yeah, that doesn't look like the way things are supposed to happen. The only place where people think that lobbyists and their contributions are not a problem is in the State House in Augusta. You talk to voters of any political persuasion outside, they would like to see lobbyist contributions banned. And so there's a lot still that can be done as this bill moves forward, both with the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee. If any of you have representatives who are on that committee, this is a great chance to talk to them. But to talk to your representatives, no matter who they are, what part of what committee they're on, they're going to have a chance, most likely, to vote on this later on in the session. And hearing from you that you care about it, it's a great thing to be able to do. So, we'd love to take your questions about clean elections, about lobbyist contribution ban. We can talk about some of the other lower priority bills that we're working on this session in the money and politics area. There's some other defensive bills. There's some other smaller changes that we are working for as well. But other than that, we are happy to take your questions about anything in money and politics.
Do we have questions? Yep, because if not, I have one thing I would love to add.
Go for it, Allison.
Okay, so, First Amendment considerations are always important, particularly in the area of campaign finance law, not just because of those Supreme Court decisions, because of actual First Amendment. We want to protect the rights of free speech of every Mainer. So, lobbyists are Mainers too, and they have a right to be heard. And so we don't want to do anything that infringes on their right to do their jobs and, speak and so forth. So one of the exceptions in the law, even today to the lobbyist bill, is that lobbyists are always able to make a $5 qualifying contribution to a candidate in their own district or who they could vote for. So the ban on contributions does not extend to their participation as regular citizens in terms of the clean election process, because those $5 qualifying contributions that candidates collect are not technically a contribution under the definition in the law. And Anna, was there another amendment offered that would allow lobbyists to make a contribution to candidates in their own district, or is that not being considered?
Yes, that also is being considered. So the two other amendments that we're looking at are allowing lobbyists to give a contribution in their own district. There's precedent for that in other state laws that have been challenged in court and upheld. There is also an example, and I believe it's either California or Alaska. One has the being able to give in your own district. One has being able to give if you are not lobbying the branch of government that the person that you're giving the contribution is in. So you could say, I never lobby in the legislature. I only ever lobby to the governor and state agencies. Therefore, I should be able to give to legislators. There's some procedural challenges to ensuring that could be enforced and putting that into the lobbyist registration, but those two amendments were being considered, and we were working on those before the next session.
And just so people are aware, this idea is part of a long line of effort over many, many years, decades, to sever the financial connection between the lobby and the legislature. So it used to be that lobbyists could go right on the House floor right before a vote and hand checks out to legislators. And eventually, lobbyists were barred from being on the House floor. And then eventually, they were barred from making contributions at all during the session. So, over the decades, Maine people have tried very hard to put some distance between legislators and the lobby when it comes to money. We don't want to, block lawmakers from hearing from lobbyists and the information they and only they can provide about their industries and whatever. But when it comes to handing over money, that's a different question. So on
we had it. Go ahead. So we had a question about the constitutional distinction between contributions from lobbyists and contributions from entities that employ them. And the distinction there is that if you, the idea is that there's a distinction that we would be making in law between an entity that employs a lobbyist versus an entity that doesn't. And if an entity that employs a lobbyist is banned from making a contribution while an entity that isn't, that would be essentially infringing the free speech rights of some entities but not others. That's why it would be a stronger argument to just say, for example, all corporations and unions could not give contributions to candidates. And we could do that, but saying only those that employ a lobbyist can't gets us into a dicier situation. Does that sound right to Allison?
Yes. Yeah, and other states take different tacks. Some focus on state contractors or, corporations in general. Some, if they do corporations, they also do unions. Others, have divisions there. But, the idea is if you're making a special restriction for some class of people, it has to be fair. You can't just, it would be looked at as, sort of punishing people for having a lobbyist, that probably would not hold up in court.
We had a question about the opposition to LD 54 and who's behind it in their arguments. And I think other than the constitutional issues that we've talked about, there is, there are some people who look at lobbyist fundraising and see it as a, source of funding for their campaigns or for their party and would rather not get rid of it. That's often been the tone that we've had from party leadership, for example, in the past, looking at the amount of money that's raised from lobbyists alone, like the actual lobbyists rather than the entity that's employing them. We're not talking about a huge amount of money. It's not going to drastically reduce the amount that goes to candidate campaigns. We're just more concerned about that source and the influence around the source rather than the amount. But there is some opposition on that angle. What else has come up?
Well, a funny thing happens once a person gets elected to the legislature. So, most of the folks we elect to our citizen legislature are a lot like us, and they have a lot of the same concerns we have. And then, once they start serving in Augusta, they have a different perspective on things. And so once they get to know the lobbyists and, understand what the lobbyists bring to the table and understand how important their caucus is and how they rely on that, and they have never thought before about how the caucus is funded, they have a different perspective. And a lot of them start thinking about this lobbyists and their money, and they think, well, I don't think I would be corrupted, if I knew that a lobbyist gave money here or there, so maybe it isn't such a big problem. The other thing is that lobbyists are very accustomed to giving money. It's part of a sort of dance that happens between, the elected officials and the lobby. So raising lobbyist money is not hard. In fact, most of the time, lobbyists, not from their own personal bank accounts, but from the industries they represent, they have money to spend on campaign contributions. So it's really not a question of, having to cultivate them like you would normally cultivate a donor to persuade them to give. It's a question of having a place to put it. Having a candidate account that can accept lobbyist contributions, having a PAC that can accept campaign contributions. So the perspective of legislators, particularly the longer they serve, is, that money's there anyway. It's going to go somewhere anyway. Why shouldn't we try to capture some of that and have, a stronger caucus bank account or, more money to give to our privately funded candidates or more, ability to have staff to help people when they're running. So, it gets to be kind of complex, and it's not the kind of thing you can go up there to a hearing and shout, you're all corrupt because you take money from lobbyists and it has to stop, because, they're the ones who ultimately have to make the call. So if you insult them and tell them you think they're corrupt, they kind of balk. So, it's a little bit, there is an element of persuasion that has to happen, and remind them that, people really do care about this, and point to some instances where, we believe the lobby may have had significant influence over whether a bill, came forward at all or succeeded or failed.
It really goes to that question of, you could say to a legislator, in fact, I did say to one in committee who was giving a lot of those arguments, I am sure that you're not corrupt. So she actually was saying to me, I've never been influenced by a lobbyist contribution. I can't imagine that I ever would be. And I just say, I'm really glad to hear that. But all of the polling shows that voters think that politicians are out to make money for themselves, that they're not representing their own interests, and it's only the interests of the people who are giving them contributions. Wouldn't you rather your voters just had that confidence in in you, or not even in you. I'm sure your voters have that confidence in you, but wouldn't you rather have them have it in everyone else too? We're having to have that sort of conversation with legislators, so that they can try to understand how big a concern it is for the public without us calling them individually corrupt. We had a conversation. Go ahead, Allison, sorry.
Well, one of the great antidotes to all of this is to encourage every legislator to use clean elections, because, in the very first go-round of clean elections, we had about a third of candidates use the system. It was brand new. Nobody had ever done this anywhere before. And I interviewed a lot of candidates back then, and one of them, who was a first-time candidate, got an invitation to go to a political action committee fundraiser. It was a caucus fundraiser. And he just had no idea. He thought, oh, maybe I should go. It seems like something that, I probably should go and network with people. So he went to this event and, didn't know many people, but very quickly realized that most of the people there, most of the guests, were lobbyists. In fact, it was all candidates, legislators, and lobbyists. That was pretty much who made up the party. And a lobbyist approached him, and I think they had name tags on, and so the guy kind of introduced himself, and they shook hands, and the lobbyist looked at his name tag and said, "Oh wait, you're running clean." And he said, "Yeah, I'm a clean election candidate." The lobbyist dropped his hand, turned around, walked away. No point in talking to that guy. So it really is a powerful thing, not only in running for office, but in serving. When candidates know that even for their next campaign, they will never have to ask a lobbyist for money or accept a donation that's offered from a lobbyist, it allows them to have a different relationship with lobbyists. And that, we think, is really valuable, to be able to listen to lobbyists, take in the information they provide, but, not have it be enhanced or colored in any way or strengthened by the promise of a financial contribution, the threat of withholding a financial contribution, to simply keep that relationship uncluttered by any sort of financial connection. That's really the most valuable thing. But as long as clean elections is a voluntary system, there will be some privately funded candidates, and then, of course, the whole political action committee world is another area.
That's a good segue. We have a question about clean elections that I'd love to have you speak to, but just before we get there, we did have a question that, is there a restriction on lobbyists making contributions to leadership PACs or to party PACs? And yes, right now they are forbidden from doing that during the session, but not outside of the session.
But not to the parties, right? Was that part of the question? Yeah, there's no restriction on giving to the party, I don't believe.
Right. So the party committees, they can, but not to the caucus PACs. So getting into splitting hairs, but I think that distinction is important. So someone asked how Maine's public financing system is different from those of other entities in the U.S. or abroad, like New York City. Is it better than them or not as good as them or other systems? I think is a great broad question. Do you want to take a first whack at that,
Sure.
Allison?
Sure, I'd be glad to. For one thing, most of those other systems are partial public funding systems. So most of them require a candidate to go out and raise money in order to then get some public funds. Some of them work as a matching fund system. The New York City council races, for example, I'm not sure what it's up to now, 6 to 1 or 10 to 1 or something. If you raise donations up to a certain amount, might be $250 or something, that will be matched by the public fund multiple times, so that it strengthens the power of smaller donations. And but almost all of these systems require candidates to hit a fundraising threshold in order to qualify. The presidential public funding system was very much like that. So they have a lot of the benefits of the public funding system, but they don't really allow a candidate to run for office without raising private money. That's one of the hallmarks of clean elections. There is an opportunity to raise a very, very limited amount of private money early in a campaign before a candidate actually qualifies for public funds in Maine system. It's called seed money, but it's extremely limited. Nobody can make those donations unless they are actually Maine voters, and they can only give up to $100. So the contribution limit is much lower, and there's a cap. So a candidate can't raise for a House race, for example, can't raise more than $1,000. So they can't get more than 10 maximum size contributions. So it's extremely limited, and it's over by the time they qualify. And if they have any unspent seed money, then that gets dumped into the Clean Election Fund. They don't get to have that plus their public distribution. Our system was altered back in 2011 because of a bad Supreme Court decision. After we passed the Maine Clean Election Act, the state of Arizona passed one modeled on ours, and they did not defend their clean election law from attack as vigorously and effectively as we did in Maine. And so they ended up losing a portion of their law, which ultimately went to the Supreme Court, and it was, the Roberts Court, and they lost the part that was called matching funds, and matching funds are different than the matching funds I just described for the New York City public funding system. And this was a system of matching funds that only kicked in if a clean election candidate was outspent. And Maine system worked this way. So if you were outspent by a privately funded opponent or by independent expenditures, you were able to receive additional dollar-for-dollar matching funds in order to keep pace. And this was a very good way of directing public monies only to where they were needed. A lot of races, are not high-spending races, so candidates would get a distribution. That was that. But if they, were outspent by their opponent, they could get more. So it kept the playing field level. Well, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that leveling the playing field was an unconstitutional idea because of this insane idea that unfettered spending was the most important value in campaigns, and so they struck down Arizona's matching fund system. So we lost it too, and we had to alter our system, and that's what we did in 2015, going back to the voters and strengthening our system by coming up with a new way of allowing candidates to keep pace with opponents. So we have a different type of system now. And since that court decision, other jurisdictions have come up with some other innovative workarounds and ways to do it. One of the most exciting experiments is in the city of Seattle, where they've come up with a system of what they call democracy vouchers, where every voter in the city gets a certain number of democracy vouchers. I think they're worth $25. And when an election comes up, they get these vouchers, and they are allowed to give them to candidates. And it's worth, it's like a $25 donation to the candidate. So it's funded by a public fund, but all the voters get to spend these democracy vouchers. So it has a way of democratizing the contributions that go into Seattle City Council races. They've used it once, they're using it again this year, and it's very exciting to see where that innovation goes and how successful it's going to be.
Yeah, it's really interesting talking to people around the country about these systems, and for a city or a state that's considering one, thinking through the pros and cons. And a lot of the advocates working on it have really come to the idea that there really isn't one perfect system, but that it will depend on the political culture in the place and what's going to work best for that jurisdiction. If we were to have a national system and something that was a little bit more coordinated, we could debate a lot of the pros and cons of what would be the best system at a federal level. But like so many things in our elections, there isn't a one standard approach or necessarily a one size fits all. And just because our question asked about international things, I wanted to add almost the very first thing that I did in thinking about money and politics. I was an intern in Transparency International Slovakia when they were considering their first campaign finance law in Slovakia, and I was asked to do research about how do different countries deal with this? What kinds of different systems are in place around the world? And so I started doing some research about that and found that in many places where they have proportional representation, and it's really the parties that run the campaigns, they have public funding for political parties rather than candidate by candidate. But at that point was when I first heard about Maine clean elections, and wrote up in my little research paper as an intern, here's another system you could look at. This is the way they do it in Maine, which isn't that so funny. That's where I'm from. So I always think about that and how there's so much that we can be learning by looking state by state and country by country and seeing what works in different places.
And interestingly, ever since we passed this law in 1996, our law has been the subject of many college papers and graduate student papers and research projects, and academics have looked at the success of what happened after we passed this. So there is a lot of interest. There's definitely a lot of interest, and even the GAO, the Government Accounting Office, did a study at one point of Arizona and Maine's public funding system. So it's one of the reasons we work so hard to keep the clean election law working and keep it strong and keep it relevant, make sure, we fix problems with it and update the various systems and address problems when they arise, because we want to continue to be a model for the rest of the nation, and certainly an inspiration to reformers around who have, steep hurdles, but they look at Maine and say, well, we just got to keep working on it. We can do it too.
I wish we should stop on that positive note. We did have a couple other questions about some of the details of the lobbyist contribution ban that I can try to see if we can get some quick answers to. We had a question about in-state versus out-of-state contributions, and if I understand correctly, that was in reference to the lobbyist contribution ban. Anyone who's a registered lobbyist in Maine would be banned from making contributions, and that does include some people who are not Maine residents. There are people who, lobby across all the New England states, for example, and register in Maine, and they would be subject to the ban in the same way that Maine residents would be if they were registered as lobbyists. And if that was not your question, please feel free to write in and we'll try to answer it again. And we had another question that just to mention that there are some lobbyists, including some very powerful lobbyists, that actually support our bill and have testified in favor of it. And, there's definitely lobbyists out there who would rather not have to make political contributions and as part of doing their job, and support the ban as well. And very good practical question. When do we expect the second work session to be on the calendar? Unfortunately, we have very little notice around when work sessions are scheduled. It's something that can move around a lot. We do put out notice about that in the Under the Dome email that goes out every Monday. If you're not receiving that yet, you can sign up for it on the League of Women Voters website, or you can email the volunteer@mainecleanelections.org and we can put you on that list. But we put out information about public hearings and work sessions on all the bills we're working out in that But it could come up anytime. So especially if your legislator is on the Veterans and Legal Affairs Committee, don't hesitate to reach out to them about the bill. And yeah, in general, don't hesitate to reach out to them about the bill.
And one important thing, it's really great to communicate with your legislators, but if your legislator has a question you can't answer or they have a strong opinion one way or the other, please relay that information or the question back to Anna, back to MCCE, so that we can address it. You don't have to be an expert in order to lobby your legislator, but they may, get into an arena where you don't feel comfortable. So you can either offer to get the answer and get back to them, or have somebody from MCCE follow up with the legislator. But whatever intelligence you get from that conversation is very useful for our grassroots lobby team to know. It's very helpful.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Even if the answer you get back is, yes, of course, I think that's a great idea, or, expletive sent back at you, which I wish I would say no legislator would ever do, but it's happened. It's worth us knowing who we need to work on, who we can count on, who we should go, ooh, okay, they're not likely to be one of our supporters. So any intelligence that you get back from your legislators is almost as helpful as the actual conversation of the legislator hearing from you. Thank you all so much. If we didn't get to your question, we will reach out afterwards. So appreciate everyone taking the time to learn and all of your great questions. You can always get in touch with us by email. If you're interested in getting more involved in any of this work, we are always looking for more people to join our advocacy committee, to come to Augusta and sit in on a hearing or a work session, to write a letter to the editor, to contact your legislator. There's lots of different ways to get involved at all different levels of what suits you. So don't hesitate to reach out. And the next training in our advocacy series next Monday, same time, is going to be on voting rights and some of our election integrity and security work. So things like automatic voter registration, early voting, election audits. Any of those are things that you're interested in and you'd like to know more about, please do attend our webinar next week. And you can watch this webinar or any others in our series by going to the Maine Citizens for Clean Elections YouTube channel. Just go open YouTube and search Maine Citizens for Clean Elections, you'll find it, and all of our webinars that we've done so far are in a playlist there. Thanks, Allison.
Oh, you're very welcome, and thank you. The success of clean elections and Maine's other stellar voting laws are largely because the legislators we elect know how important this is to Maine people. They know that Maine people are going to vigorously defend the laws we like and vigorously fight against the threats to them. So it's on all of us to keep up that great work to keep Maine's legacy of fair and easily accessed elections. So thanks everybody for your interest.
Everyone has a great night, and we will be talking to you soon.
Bye-bye.